When we're naming ionic compounds that contain polyatomic ions, you should think of the polyatomic ion as one unit, or one ion. Don't be tempted to break it up into its constituent elements. So again, we're still talking about binary ionic compounds where you have the positive cation on the left and the negative anion on the right. And so there's really no great way to learn the polyatomic ions other than to memorize them. So in general, I think flashcards are a good tool for that. So let's look at some examples. The first example, let's start simple. NaOH, and so the first thing you should recognize is that it's only going to be two ions. So this is the sodium ion, and we know that sodium always has a +1 charge. And if you know your polyatomic ions, you'll recognize this as hydroxide. So this is the sodium ion, and this is the hydroxide polyatomic ion. And so if you can find out the ions that make up the compound, and you know their names, you just put the names together. So drop the ion and call this sodium hydroxide. Okay, so the first thing you have to do is really figure out the polyatomic ions and have them memorized. Second example, let's do something a little more interesting. We have NH4 3, PO4, and if you're familiar with your polyatomic ions, you will recognize this as a compound made up of two polyatomic ions. So this is 3 NH4 pluses, so that's one positive ion. The NH4 plus ion is called ammonium ion, and then you'll recognize this one as the phosphate ion, PO4 3 minus. So the anion is ammonium, or sorry, the cation is ammonium, the anion is the phosphate ion. And so we just put the names together. This is ammonium phosphate. Okay, now let's try one where we have a transition metal and a polyatomic ion. And so we'll have to figure out what the charge is on the transition metal. So let's do cobalt. And you'll recognize that polyatomic ion as sulfate. So if we know the polyatomic ion, we can figure out the charge on the transition metal. So this is sulfate, which has a 2- charge. There are 3 of those, so that's 6-. 2 cobalts, there's no overall charge on this compound, so this must be cobalt 3+. So we've got 2 3+ and 3 2- charges. So this is the cobalt 3 ion. This is the sulfate anion. And so we just put the names together. This is cobalt 3 sulfate.